Hello and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our study of Philippians, and today's study will be on the start of chapter 3. Here in the writing that's present in chapter 3 and the book of epistles, Epistle of Philippians makes a significant change, radical break, as some of the scholars refer to it, as compared to what was being covered in chapters 1 and 2. Thus, scholars generally suggest this is from a different letter than the previous material. And that what's going on here, they think, is accounted for pretty well by the fact that they believe that Philippians is involved merged letters, either material that is being merged directly into the other text, or is more likely set in between because of the abrupt change. These items, they believe, these letters, independent letters, originally were sent along and stood along for a good while with the community, the Philippian community, and then at some point in time they were merged into what we have today as the Epistle of the Philippians. Paul is strongly debating with his opposition here in what we're going to read today, and he uses his own autobiographical material in that argument. Dr. Charles Kosser taught the wording in Greek here is much more complex than it tends to get translated into in English, and therefore he advised his students and ministers using his material to stay closely and consult closely with Greek scholarship as they use these verses. So let's read the first 11 verses of chapter 3 in the New Revised Standard Version. Finally, my brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same thing to you is not troublesome to me, and for you it is a safeguard. Beware of the dogs. Beware of evil workers. Beware of those who mutilate the flesh. For it is we who are the circumcision, who worship in the Spirit of God, and boast in Christ Jesus, and have no confidence in the flesh, even though I too have reasons for confidence in the flesh. If anyone else has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, a member of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to the righteousness under the law, blameless. Yet, whatever gains I had, these I have come to regard as loss because of Christ. More than that, I regard everything as loss because of the surpassing value of knowing Jesus Christ my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things, and I regard them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ, and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but one that comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God, based on faith. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the sharing of his suffering, by becoming like him in his death, if somehow I may attain the resurrection from the dead. The opening word, finally, there in verse 1, causes issues, translators say. The Bible, especially with Bible editors, they don't know where to divide this. Some you'll see divides it with material in chapter 3. Some versions will divide it with chapter 2. Most modern Greek scholars suggest it goes with the new material in chapter 3. A few set on the fence, however, and say maybe it fits either one or the other, or some of them even argue it fits both. Scholars mostly agree, however, that Philippians is a hybrid of other writings, and they conclude that likely explains the awkwardness that we encounter here in chapter 3, especially as we leave chapter 2 and go into 3. Some say it is a hybrid of 2 letters, while others argue it is a hybrid of 3 letters. Those who consider there to be only 2 letters assume this is what they refer to here to as from letter B. Those 3-letter people or scholars suggest letter A is the verses chapter 4, verse 10 through 20, which is a simple thank you for the gifts that were sent by Epaphroditus for Paul. Letter B, they conclude, involves all the material of chapter 1 up through the first verse of chapter 3, plus chapter 4, verses 2 through 7 and 21 through 23, which addresses the church dispute that's going on here and the conclusions. And then they label that 3rd letter, label C, they consider it to be a debate between opponents of Paul, or involving opponents of Paul, which is verses 3:1 that we started with here today through the first verse of chapter 4. Relative to these versions, the verses that we read here today, scholars focus on particulars surrounding the meaning of the term circumcision as used here by Paul. What did Paul mean here, they say, at the time he wrote it? He is using it both metaphorically and literally. Some suggest Paul is implying, by using circumcision, that the church is under the Abrahamic covenant. Such an argument, then, would go like this. Yes, the Gentiles are physically uncircumcised relative to their foreskin, but Paul is claiming that they are now God's people and thus covered by the promises made to the patriarch and prophet Abraham. Some modern writers want to use it to mean the physical act of circumcision has been done on these Christian Gentiles, but most scholars reject that. Several scholars remind their readers that what they think Paul is referring to is the reference to circumcision in Deuteronomy and Jeremiah, where it's very clear that circumcision of the heart, a spiritual aspect, must accompany the physical act, taught Dr. Charles Cosser. He and others strongly suggest Paul is referring to the heart here, or the spiritual changes, with no need for physical circumcision being required. Paul is saying the spiritual changes are what matters to God, not the outward physical marks and alteration of the foreskin. Furthermore, Paul is implying these spiritual changes result in changed actions that express God's will here on earth in the believer. Paul seems to identify those he is debating with here by using the word dogs. The term dogs, some suggest, he's likely using this to refer to other Christian missionaries claiming that physical circumcision of the foreskin is mandatory for Gentiles to enter the Abrahamic covenant, just like it was for the Israelites to be covered by it, or the Gentile converts who enter Judaism. These people are also called elsewhere in other parts of the New Testament, sometimes Judaizers. Scholars remark that theological implications here are significant. Paul is using strong language by saying dogs, evil workers, he says, mutilators, etc. This word dogs was the term used by Jews in a belittling or insulting manner for non-Jewish Palestinians. We see this being used early on and during the late parts of the Old Testament, and also in the Apocryphal material, and in some of the writings of the Gospels. It has been well established that Jewish and Israelite faiths required circumcision of the male at birth, not only of themselves, but also for any outsider converting to their religion as an adult even. So implied here is this idea that some in Christianity are demanding it for entry into Christianity if you're going to be a member of the Abrahamic faith. That seems to be where scholars focus their argument, that underlying this is this assumption of the Abrahamic faith. Dr. James Thompson, an Abilene Christian, suggests they likely did such on the grounds of rules of purification and perfection, because Paul uses that in his retort to them here. His argument is, I was circumcised at birth, since I was born a Jew, and was most righteous under the law, but it did not make me pure and holy when compared to the standards now needed under the cross of Christ, or the understanding and the faith in the cross of Christ. Here Paul lays out his inheritance and achievement qualifications that counted high under the old law, and under the law of the flesh, as he called it. They were very high, which by Jewish standards of his day were at the tops. That's the thing we need to understand, that what's laid out here is right at the tops as far as purification and righteousness. But now, as a Christian, Paul considers those to be rubbish, or that word that's translated rubbish there is also translated dung. It's the same word used for dung, compared to the faith in Christ standards, the qualification that comes from God, as he uses it. What were these previous credentials? Basically, what was his previous credentials that would have counted so highly? He reviews them there. He's born an Israelite and a Jew from the most favored tribe of Benjamin, one of the three tribes of Jew that were considered Jews. He was as faithful, pious, and zealous as one could be. Born under the law, circumcised on the 8th day, lived strictly by the law as a Pharisee, a student of Gamaliel, a most highly respected rabbinic teacher. Furthermore, I was so zealous I persecuted the church out of true belief it was wrong, is an implied understanding there. We tend sometimes to get this wrong. Paul persecuted the church when he persecuted the church because he thought the church was wrong. He has a paradigm shift. So if all this counts towards anything of his past, it should have had him in the highest level of confidence that he had salvation. But now he sees, I do not consider all that to be of any value. It's a total loss when the knowledge of Jesus Christ as my Lord was understood by me. So Paul went through a radical religious paradigm shift, and now has a new paradigm, that is, a new understanding All the fleshly stuff he had achieved, which was high, is of rubbish. It's as dung, to be discarded and of no value. Paul now argues it is the faith, not fleshly circumcision, that is essential toward salvation and entry into the Abrahamic covenant, writes Dr. Morna Hooker of Cambridge. That is the Christian paradigm. Verses 10 and 11, scholars note, are difficult to interpret in the Greek, especially, and how it relates to the previous verses especially. Some suggest Paul has shifted here and is focused on bodily resurrection of Christ, while others think Paul is indicating the need to share, actually, that he needs to share in the same kind of suffering death that Christ did. Scholars are not in good agreement here as to exactly what is meant, other than that Paul seems to understand as a necessity of being obedient to God's will, as Christ was. Others say, well, he's applying that you may be called on to have to go through that and so forth. Others suggest Paul is just saying here that resurrection is what will be necessary to prove to these outsiders, those debating that to die like Christ and be resurrected like Christ, that will be the proof when that happens, or if for some reason it was called upon to be happened before. He clearly seems to imply the Christian needs to be prepared to suffer as Christ did in obedience to God's will. And if so, it's a high reward, maybe is implied, some say. The wording translated faith in Christ versus faithfulness of Christ. You see it both ways in this set of scriptures, depending on who you read. Takes center stage in some compendia written on these verses. Dr. James Thompson teaches that the thing debated here is what is the alternative to the law or works. The Greek words used here can mean either faith in Christ or faithfulness of Christ. Either way, the very same Greek words can be interpreted either way. It is awkward here in the Greek, taught Dr. Charles Kossel. Several note that everywhere Paul clearly says faith in Christ elsewhere. And earlier in Philippians 1 verse 28, faith itself was, according to Paul, not a human virtue. That is, not a human achievement, but rather a gift of grace from God. In other words, the ability to even have the faith comes from God. It's part of the grace. Dr. Richard Hayes wrote in 2002, defending Paul's logic here, and he basically said the following: Paul is simply pitting a human activity, that is, obedience to the law, against a divine activity, faith in Christ Jesus. This faith in Christ Jesus as faith in that Christ was obedient to God, and that is the plan. Rather than pitting two competing human activities against one another, that is, believing in Christ, a human activity, versus obedience to the law. That's the contrast. And if that is the case, he says, then Paul is teaching here that it was a divine activity that makes the difference, rather than any human activity that any of us could possibly do. That is, Paul is implying here, I did all that was possible to qualify for salvation under human activity, under human standards. But all that achievement by human standards is rubbish under God's rules. What counts to God is what God did for me with Christ's suffering and death on that cross, and the grace that He gives me to understand what that was all about, and what that was God's doings. I must accept that, he says. So Philippians, sort of a warning. He's warning the Philippians, then do not be listening to this rubbish that's coming from these alternative ministers and missionaries out here that are claiming that you have to do some things physically in order to achieve salvation. That's not the case, the scholars say. This debate is about what is necessary for salvation and not about what the community rules of behavior should be. The gift is from God, and the gift to understand it comes from God. These are difficult verses, scholars say. We tend to read through these and not think much about them, but the scholars debate these very strongly, as this is some very strong theology present here in the book of Philippians. I hope this gives you some understanding of how some of the lead scholars look at it, and you have a good Bible study, and we'll move along in Philippians next week.